Every person in tonight's stories had something in common. The cave warned them before anything went wrong. The unsettling part is that most of them noticed the warning and kept going anyway. A strange feeling, a crack in the rock, a stain on the wall that didn't belong there. Small details that seemed easy to explain at the time. Looking back, those details became the moments they couldn't stop thinking about. Most cave disasters aren't caused by a single mistake. They're often the result of warning signs that only make sense afterward. Tonight's stories follow 3 very different expeditions, but they all end with the same realization. The danger was already there, long before anyone understood what they were seeing. Looking back, each of them could point to the exact moment things started to go wrong. The problem was that none of those moments felt dangerous at the time. The first story begins with a woman who believed she had prepared for everything. Most people assume the greatest danger underground is getting lost. Others think it's a collapse or a flooded passage. What makes this story unsettling is that the threat wasn't something the caver could see. By the time she realized something was wrong, it had already been affecting her for hours. Emily was an experienced caver, exploring a familiar route, when a section of unstable rock shifted and pinned her lower body against the floor. The collapse wasn't catastrophic. She remained conscious, had no major injuries, and still had food, water, and spare batteries. Her team knew roughly where she was, so at first, the situation felt manageable. According to her later account, she believed the hardest part would simply be waiting for rescue. For the first few hours, that's exactly what she did. She inventoried supplies, checked her equipment, and tried to stay calm. The chamber around her was silent, except for the occasional sound of water dripping somewhere beyond her light. Nothing appeared to be getting worse. In fact, she began feeling strangely relaxed. At first, she assumed the panic was simply fading, but as time passed, she noticed it was becoming harder to focus. Small calculations required effort. She found herself staring at the cave wall for long stretches without realizing how much time had passed. More surprisingly, she no longer felt particularly concerned about being trapped. Looking back, that should have frightened her. Instead, it felt comforting. What Emily didn't know was that the chamber where she was trapped had poor air circulation. Fresh oxygen wasn't moving through the space properly, while carbon dioxide levels were slowly increasing. The effects can be deceptive. Rather than triggering immediate panic, elevated CO2 often causes drowsiness, confusion, and impaired judgment. In other words, the very symptoms she was experiencing. When rescuers finally reached her location several hours later, they expected to find someone frightened and desperate. Instead, they found a woman who appeared unusually detached from her situation. One rescuer later described it as unsettling because she seemed almost indifferent to the fact that she was trapped. Medical evaluations afterward revealed how close the situation had become. The rock slide itself wasn't the greatest threat. The air was. What makes this story linger is that Emily never recognized the danger while it was happening. She spent hours carefully rationing food, water, and batteries, never realizing the thing running out first was something she couldn't see at all. The next story begins with a guide who believed he knew every inch of the cave he was leading people through. Unfortunately, that confidence turned out to be the most dangerous thing he brought underground. He had led more than 200 tours through that cave. That confidence is exactly what killed them. One of the most dangerous things that can happen in any wilderness environment is becoming familiar with it. Experience teaches people what to look for, but it can also convince them they've already seen everything. That's what makes this story unsettling. The cave didn't suddenly become dangerous. The warning signs were there long before the collapse happened. The guide had spent years leading visitors through the system and was considered one of the most experienced people in the area. He knew the route so well that many tourists specifically requested him. On the day of the tour, the weather was clear, the group was small, and nothing appeared underground. Several visitors later recalled how relaxed he seemed. His confidence made everyone else feel safe. About an hour into the trip, one visitor noticed fresh rock fragments scattered along part of the trail. They weren't large, but they looked recently fallen. The guide glanced at them and explained that small pieces of rock occasionally broke away in caves. The answer sounded reasonable, and the group continued deeper. A short time later, another visitor mentioned hearing faint cracking sounds somewhere above them. The noises were difficult to locate and came and went without warning. Once again, the guide wasn't concerned. He had heard similar sounds before and assured everyone there was no danger. Eventually, the group arrived at one of the largest chambers in the cave. It was a place where the guide had stopped countless times during previous tours. According to investigators, he considered it one of the safest areas in the system. Then the ceiling moved. Several survivors later described hearing a deep grinding sound, followed by a shower of dust. People looked up just as part of the chamber's ceiling broke loose and crashed into the area below. The collapse happened in seconds. When rescue crews eventually reached the site, multiple people had been injured, and the guide was among those killed. At first, investigators treated the incident as a tragic accident caused by natural geological processes. That assumption changed when they found his journal. Among routine notes about cave conditions was an entry written just 3 weeks earlier. In it, he described newly formed fractures near the same chamber. He had even questioned whether the area should be avoided until it could be inspected more closely. But he never reported the concern. Nobody knows exactly why. Maybe he convinced himself the cracks weren't serious. Maybe years of successful tours made the risk seem smaller than it really was. Or maybe the cave had become so familiar that he stopped seeing it as something capable of changing. Whatever the reason, the warning remained buried in that journal until after the collapse. That's what makes this story difficult to forget. The danger wasn't hidden. It had already been noticed. It had even been documented, but it wasn't taken seriously. The final story begins with another warning sign, a fresh mudline on a cave wall. Most of the group never noticed it. The one person who did convinced himself it probably didn't matter. They had mapped every passage, except the one that filled with water overnight. Most people think cave floods happen during storms. They imagine explorers hearing rushing water and scrambling for safety while conditions rapidly deteriorate around them. What makes this story unsettling is that the flood began far away from the cave itself. By the time the team realized anything was wrong, the process had already been unfolding for hours. The group consisted of experienced recreational cavers, exploring a system they had visited before. The route wasn't considered especially dangerous. It included a series of chambers, several narrow passages, and a low section known as a sump. On the way into the cave, the sump wasn't flooded at all. According to everyone involved, they crossed it without getting their boots wet and continued deeper into the system. For most of the day, the trip felt routine. They mapped side passages, photographed formations, and spent time exploring sections of the cave that received relatively few visitors. Nothing seemed out of place. If anything, several members later described the cave as unusually quiet. There was, however, one detail that caught Eric's attention. As the group moved deeper underground, he noticed a distinct mud line running along portions of the cave wall. In some areas, bits of debris were caught on ledges several feet above the floor. The marks looked fresh, as though water had occupied the passage recently and receded. He stopped to examine them more than once. The evidence bothered him because it didn't seem to match the conditions they were seeing. The weather forecast had been clear. The cave appeared dry. Nobody else seemed concerned. Eventually, he convinced himself he was overthinking it. He never mentioned what he had seen. Hours later, the team began making their way back toward the entrance. At first, nothing seemed unusual. They followed familiar passages, retraced their route, and expected to be back on the surface before nightfall. Then they reached the Sump and stopped. The passage they remembered crossing earlier was gone. In its place was a pool of dark water stretching from wall to wall. Headlamp beams reflected from the surface before disappearing into blackness. The tunnel beyond was completely submerged. Several members initially assumed they had taken a wrong turn. They checked landmarks, reviewed their maps, and retraced part of the route. The conclusion remained the same. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. Their exit was underwater. What the group didn't know was that heavy rainfall had occurred many miles away earlier that day. Water entering the region's Karst system had traveled underground through channels completely disconnected from the weather conditions they experienced at the surface. While they explored deeper sections of the cave, the flood had quietly transformed the Sump into a submerged barrier. The realization settled over the group slowly. None of them had dive gear. None of them knew how far the flooded section extended, and none of them knew whether the water level was still rising. According to later interviews, that uncertainty was the hardest part. The cave suddenly felt different. Every sound drew attention. Water dripping from the ceiling seemed louder than before. Small currents moving through cracks became impossible to ignore. More than one person admitted they found themselves staring into the darkness, wondering what else might be changing beyond the reach of their lights. As the group discussed their options, someone mentioned the possibility that the flooding wasn't entirely unexpected. That comment immediately brought Eric back to the mudline he had noticed earlier in the day. Until that moment, he had managed to convince himself it wasn't important. Looking at the submerged passage in front of him, that explanation no longer felt convincing. He finally told the others what he had seen. The fresh staining along the walls, the debris caught on ledges several feet above the floor, the signs that water had recently occupied parts of the cave that now appeared completely dry. As he described it, nobody interrupted him. The group simply listened while the pieces began falling into place. What made the realization so unsettling wasn't that they had missed some hidden danger. The evidence had been visible the entire time. They had walked past it, photographed nearby formations, and continued deeper into the system without giving it much thought. The cave hadn't changed without warning. It had left clues that something unusual had happened there recently. What would have happened if they had turned around when they first saw the signs? What connects all three of these stories isn't the flood, the collapse, or the lack of oxygen. It's the warning. In every case, something felt wrong before the situation became dangerous. A subtle change in the air, fresh fractures in the rock, a mudline on a cave wall that didn't belong there. None of those signs seemed important at the time. It was only afterward that they became impossible to forget. That's what makes caves unsettling. The danger rarely announces itself. More often, it appears as a small detail that's easy to explain away until the consequences become impossible to ignore. Maybe that's why these stories stay with people long after they leave the cave. Most of us like to believe we'd recognize the warning signs if we saw them. We'd notice the crack in the ceiling, question the strange stain on the wall, or turn around when something didn't feel quite right. The people in these stories probably believed the same thing. Looking back, each of them could point to a moment that seemed insignificant at the time, but felt very different afterward. Watching from somewhere dark and quiet tonight? Drop where you're watching from below. And if these stories stay with you, consider subscribing. Stay safe in the dark.